Sex. For many of you that have grown up in California, this topic was first introduced probably by your middle school gym teacher. Before January of 2016, over 90% of California schools were teaching some form of sexual education. But since it was not mandated, many school districts have been providing students with inaccurate and biased information about sexual health, according to the ACLU of Northern California. As of January 2016, California personally passed a bill that made it only the 24th state to provide a consistent, unified way that sexual education is taught in a classroom. From this information, the major claim that I want to talk with you about today is that the failure to have a required, consistent sex education curriculum in the United States is detrimental or harmful to students. I plan to prove this by 1, showing you that this failure to have a singular sex education curriculum program produces too much ambiguity or uncertainness in students' sexual decisions. As well as number 1. Number 2, by showing that having a variety of different sex education curriculums leads to the unsuccessful education of the majority of students when it comes to sexual health. Starting with my first supporting claim, the failure to have one national sex education curriculum that is both required and accurate produces too much ambiguity. According to a Guttmacher Institute State Policies and Group Analysis that came out in March 2016, only 24 states mandate sexual education, meaning that all students are not being educated on the same level or have access to the same information or even being educated at all. This leads to severe gaps in understanding the key aspects of sexual health, such as pregnancy and disease or infection prevention, that have the potential to affect every single person. According to the same exact policy analysis, when providing a sex education curriculum, only 13 states require that the instruction be medically accurate. By potentially allowing almost 75% of the nation's states to teach students the wrong information pertaining to sex and sexual health, students are divided on the basic do's and don'ts of sexual health. As a result, the consequences of the current sex education curriculum requirements in America were seen in a 2014 poll by the Washington Post. When college students were asked, what if someone undresses, or gets a condom, or nods in agreement, qualifies as consent for more sexual activity, at least 40% said yes, it established more consent, and at least 40% said it did not. Failing to properly educate students across the board has left too much room for detrimental ambiguity that is leaving students in a rather sticky situation. Now that we've gone through that, let's look at my second supporting claim about how the failure to have a required, consistent sex education curriculum in the U.S. is harmful to students. My second supporting claim is that having a variety of different sex education curriculums leads to the unsuccessful education of the majority of students. Focusing on an abstinence-only education curriculum that is found in 26 states in the U.S., the Center for Disease Control found that the average age Americans lose their virginity is 17.1 for both men and women. Therefore, teaching an abstinence-only program isn't only impractical, but it's inadequate in teaching students what they really need to know. Restrictions of topics in sex education curriculums are also causing dire consequences for students. According to Mississippi's sex education law, it allows for talk of contraceptives in a sex education curriculum, but specifically prohibits condom demonstrations in a sex education class. Connected to this lack of helpful information, Mississippi ranks second in the nation on teen pregnancy rates, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In conclusion, as seen through these claims, not properly educating all students across the nation produces substantial harm and negative effects to students. To make it relevant to you all, the sexual education that you learned in middle school and high school has the potential to impact your decisions, whether you realize it or not. As an example, for some students, without the proper awareness of sexual health, the fastest way to end your college education is through an unintended pregnancy. Thank you.
All right, well, the proposition got a little complicated, but it's clearly identified. The contents are previewed effectively, so we know where you're going. They're only the 2 points that you've got. There appear to be additional explanations under the individual points. Some of those need to be a little bit more distinct, and I think you could get away with the 2 points that you've got if those minor points were developed a little bit more as distinct claims that are being used to support the point above it, as opposed to being presented like it's just basically background data or information, because I think there are lots of presuppositions in the arguments. For instance, a demonstration that any education makes a difference in the onset of when sexual contact first happens, or for instance that it prevents pregnancies. There's just, that's an assumption that's being made. The claim that there's a statistical inference implied on the Mississippi example that suggests that because they don't show kids how to use condoms, that's why the pregnancy rate is so high in Mississippi. And I think that you need a little bit more information on that argument to justify that kind of conclusion. And there's some other places that have the same kinds of inferences that you're drawing, where I think you've got good information, but there's often a point or two that's missing that would make the argument more convincing, or there's a premise there that needs to be demonstrated in order to support the conclusion that you're offering. The internal signposts were relatively clear and easy to follow. You started off citing your evidence pretty consistently, but then, like I said, there are some places where there's not quite that same degree of citation. Statistical information, the information that you had on how people perceived, whether or not taking a particular action was an invitation to or consent for additional sexual contact. That's interesting information, but the notion that it's related to the ambiguity of the education that the kids had, I think that's a little bit problematic. Good factual data on what the states require or don't require, although I'm not exactly sure that because states don't have it specified that they have to have medically accurate information, that means that they're okay with medically inaccurate information. It's one of those things. It's like, well, we have math as the curriculum, and we expect people to teach math. We expect them to teach it right. The question is, are they not teaching it right? I think you need to have some information there that shows those particular points. All right. Oh, and I thought it was very nicely, as I'm listening to the language, I thought that the language was really excellent in the presentation, and you explain it well. Like I said, I just think that there are some premises that you need a little bit more information on. All right. Thank you.